Welcome to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about Plato's Republic. Um, Plato's Republic is arguably his most famous work, and it's arguably also the one where Plato has the most development of his own ideas. And there's actually a number of books, chapters. So a book is really a chapter in the Republic, and I think there's like 10 or so. And we're only going to be going over the book one and a little part of book two, which is labeled as the Ring of Gyges. Talks about that story. Um, in book one, there's a lot going on. Let me first preface this text by, again, mentioning the idea of a Socratic definition. We saw this a little bit in Euthyphro, but the way in which, Plato's dialogues tend to work are, you have a definition of some kind of philosophical concept like justice or whatnot. And then you kind of pursue it, and if it collapses or there's an inconsistency there, that definition changes, and the interlocutor, whoever's talking to Socrates, is usually the one proposing the definitions, and Socrates is usually tearing those definitions apart in some different way. And behind this is the idea of a Socratic definition. A Socratic definition is basically a definition of a philosophical concept that's supposed to give us the essence of that concept, right? It's supposed to give us what that thing is in its essence. And so, what does that mean? Well, it means that we can't just give like an example of something. So if you say, what's ethics? And you say, well, it's about like, that murder is wrong and stealing is wrong or something like that. Those are examples of ethical principles, but that doesn't really tell you what separates ethical concerns from other kinds of concerns, right? So why is stealing an ethical issue and making a bagel not an ethical issue? It doesn't really give you an answer to that. You need something more substantial, and it also means like not superficial descriptions of what goes on. So if you say, what is justice, and you're like, justice is what happens in a courtroom, or something like that, right? That's not going to be enough. That doesn't really tell you what justice is in and of itself, or ethics is in and of itself. And for like Platonic dialogues, that would also, be true for like knowledge or wisdom or things like these kinds of concepts. So, following suit, Plato's Republic follows this format, and I identify in my notes three different definitions. Well, four. There's a refinement of the third one, and we'll go through those, and then Thrasymachus is kind of the main interlocutor that comes on the scene that proposes probably the most significant challenge to Plato, and that's what we'll focus on here. But to go through the definitions first, Socrates' interlocutor, they're looking for, the whole dialogue is about what is justice, right? And the first definition of justice that is proposed is to give back what one has taken from another person, right? So giving back what you might have taken from someone else. And Socrates quickly dispenses with this, and he gives a really interesting example. And he says, what if you have a friend that's kind of asks you to hold on to a weapon for him, and then like in a fit of madness, he comes back and he's like, "Give me my weapons back," right? He's like, "Would that be the just thing to do, to give him those weapons?" And Socrates' interlocutor says, "No, no, that's not right." And so he says, "Okay, so we have to expand on this idea." And the second definition is that justice is restoring to each person what is due to them. This idea is actually a somewhat popular idea in understanding justice. And one way to think about this is what's called just deserts, right? Getting a person getting what they deserve. And a lot of practices around punishment in the justice system kind of revolve around this concept, right? That a person goes to prison for X amount of years because that's what they deserve for whatever they did. Um, and this is dispensed with just because, again, it's just too narrow, right? Because there's lots of other parts of justice, right? What about following the law? What about doing all kinds of positive things where a person is not really given anything or given any kind of punishment or given any kind of reward necessarily, right? You just like do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That's all kind of left out of that definition. So we need more. Um, and so now the definition kind of takes an interesting turn. And the third definition is that justice is doing good to friends and doing harm to enemies, right? And there's an interesting refinement here of this definition, which is that justice is doing good to who is in fact one's friend and doing harm to who is in fact one's enemy, right? And Socrates kind of raises this issue that you could be doing harm to people who you think are your enemies but are really your friends, or you could be doing good for people who you think are your friends but are really your enemies. And that distinction is actually pretty significant on a lot of different levels, specifically for Plato's own views and philosophy. But this idea, the difference between what you think is right and what is actually right, is a really significant one for ethics, right? When we're studying ethics, we want to know what the right thing to do is, full stop. We don't want to just know what we think is the right thing, right? So given this, and that we have this definition of doing that justice is doing good to people who are in fact your friends and doing harm to people who are in fact your enemies, Socrates raises a very interesting argument against this. And his overall position is that it's never okay to harm another person. And he actually raises the issue that actually doing harm to people only makes them worse. It doesn't help them, right? So he gives an argument to, I summarize it like this in my notes, that harming something does not help make it better, but worse. He usually uses horse breeding or something to make this point. A just person is supposed to make others just or make other people better, more excellent, or more virtuous, right? That's what a just person does. They make the world a better place. And by the above definition, a just person is supposed to harm enemies, according to the third definition that we have. And therefore, on that definition, a just person is actually fails to make other people better or make the world a better place, right? And then Socrates arrives at the conclusion that he has discovered that there is no instance in which it is just to injure anyone. Now, this is a pretty controversial idea, um, and but there's a lot to back it up on the kind of Platonic view here, and there's a lot of real world examples to support this idea. Where you might think, you're keeping someone in line by harming them or punishing them in certain ways, and that oftentimes backfires. People thing instances like child abuse, people who go to prison, come out, they're unable to integrate into society. These kinds of instances where we think we're doing the right thing by doling out punishment, but it really doesn't help anyone. So anyways, so this is a really interesting view. Of course, some people think the opposite, where that there are instances in which harming someone else is warranted and actually really necessary, and it's the just thing to do. That you shouldn't necessarily like reward someone for doing something bad. Um, but of course, there is a question about what harming someone really amounts to, right? So doing something to someone that they don't like is not always harming them, right? So imagine, someone going to the dentist, right? They might view that as being harmful to them, but the dentist is not harming them, right? It's actually making them better. They don't like it; it's uncomfortable, but it is actually for the greater good and for their particular good, the person, the patient, right? So there's a lot of interesting issues here that come up with this Socratic definition. But at this point in the dialogue, an interesting turn kind of happens where this guy Thrasymachus kind of bursts on the scene, and he says that Socrates is kind of being simple-minded, and he's evading all kinds of hard questions, and he says, I know the real definition of justice. And they all say, okay, what is it? And he says, justice is the interest of the stronger, right? And so what does this mean exactly? The easiest way to understand this, I think, is the slogan, might is right, right? The interests of the stronger are the interests of the people in power. So for Thrasymachus, justice is all about people in power making policies and laws and rules based on what will help them stay ahead and get ahead further, right? So it's the idea that things like politicians and very wealthy people create rules and laws to serve their own interests, right? And so the idea that might is right is really the idea that the people in power create the rules. They say what is just, right? And so justice is really about acting out of self-interest, and the people who have the power are the people who are able to kind of make general policies so that everyone kind of acts in accord with their particular interests, right? So it would be, a good instance of this would be like, say, a dictator or something of a country that makes certain policies and laws that will, keep that person in power, and maybe, make them wealthier, and make sure that there's no one can kind of speak up against them and all these kinds of things, right? That's a very pronounced version of this. Now, this is a kind of relativistic claim. What Thrasymachus is doing here, he's making a fairly radical claim, right? From the position of people who are kind of common, ordinary citizens, what he's saying is that everything we think is just, all the kind of principles of honesty and charity and just punishment and all these kinds of stuff, that's all a farce, right? He thinks we're all under a big illusion where we think that those things are universal principles of right and wrong, and that we've all just been taught to believe that by people who are in power, right? So it's kind of it's what's known as a relativistic view of ethics, in the sense that what is ethical, what is right or wrong, the measure of right or wrong is really relative to the interests or belief system of the people in power, right? And so there are no universal or absolute standards of justice or ethics, right? There's no universal or absolute standard of right and wrong that people in power need to adhere to, right? And the idea that there are, he thinks, is kind of one that we've adopted because we are kind of the sheep, right? Taking on this kind of false sense of right and wrong, right? So it's pretty radical, and one really has to grasp this idea um, that he's really rejecting our common sense view of ethics, and basically saying that it's all illusory, right? And grasping that idea is really key to understanding what Thrasymachus is saying. Um, and so, as we go on, what Thrasymachus will believe is really the right thing to do is to do a lot of things that we tend to think are wrong, right? So, being selfish, he thinks, is good. That's what you should be doing, right? And that selfish people actually win out over people who are selfless, and lying is okay if you kind of get over on other people, and basically, it's kind of a dog eat dog world, and the quicker you realize that, the better off you'll be, right? So this is a huge challenge. I mean, I think Plato sets him up in the beginning of this whole book, this whole text, to pose a huge challenge to him. And so so there's a series of rejections of this claim, or ways in which Plato's going to press against this view. And the first one is this question about what is a ruler, right? And because Thrasymachus is talking about, might is, or justice is the interest of the stronger, and the stronger he's talking about are usually like political strength, right? Social strength. Not necessarily people who are the biggest and strongest, right? Because people with social power can kind of wield armies and these kinds of things, and organization. So the idea is, okay, so then he asks the question, what is a ruler? What is the rulers you're talking about? And Plato's idea, or Socrates here, thinks that a ruler is one whose interest is one who rules in the interest of the people over which she rules, right? So that's what you do as a ruler. You kind of serve the people of your community. If you are a leader or a ruler in that community, you want to find out what people need and what people want, and then do your best to implement that. That's what you do. You rule out of interest of your subjects, right? And this is what a ruler is, kind of like by definition, an ideal ruler, our concept of what a ruler ought to be. There are cases in which rulers kind of fall short of this, right? Something that's like a corrupt politician who, actually is really, you know, acting out of self-interest under the guise of acting out of the interests of citizens, right? But that is a deficient mode of being a ruler or a politician, right? It's not the ideal. It's not the definition of a politician. And so, based on this, Socrates thinks that being a ruler is really not acting out of self-interest, but it's really acting out of the interest of others. And that's what it is to be a ruler. And so, if that's true, then it seems like Thrasymachus' definition that the people in power rule out of self-interest, and that's what it is to be kind of a good or ethical ruler by his kind of skewed sense of ethics, it seems to kind of fall apart, um, because it runs up against our very conception of a ruler. One way to think about this is to think that, if you know someone's corrupt at the outset, you're probably not going to vote for them. You're not going to put them in power. If they're open about the idea that they just want to kind of screw everyone over, then no one's going to support them, right? And that being a corrupt ruler really only works as kind of like an exception to the rule, right? So it's not really a sustainable view of what a ruler is, right? So this is one way in which Socrates is pushing against Thrasymachus. Now, Thrasymachus's response is that, Socrates is being overly idealistic. He's kind of a fool for thinking that people are um, uh, are out to really kind of serve others and all this kind of stuff, and that really people are out for self-interest, and he kind of doubles down on this idea. And so Socrates kind of expands on this notion of a ruler, and thinking about ruling as a craft like other crafts. And so he considers a bunch of different crafts, and what Thrasymachus says is that really someone's out for themselves, and so whatever craft one's pursuing, one's doing it in order to kind of like get ahead, usually monetarily, right? And so you can think of lots of different crafts, something like medicine, right? What is a doctor doing when he or she practices medicine? For Thrasymachus, that person's trying to make money, right? What about, someone who builds houses, right? That person for Thrasymachus is trying to make money, right? That's all their ultimate aim. And um, uh, Socrates' position is that actually the craft has to precede self-interest, right? And in this case, we'll talk about money, right? And so there's kind of a question here: what does a shoemaker do? And for Thrasymachus, a shoemaker makes money. For Socrates, a shoemaker makes shoes, right? And the idea here is that if one is focused on making money and not on their craft, in this case, making shoes, then one will make really bad shoes and then they won't make money, right? So if the money precedes the craft, then the craft is corrupted, right? And then you make an inferior product and then you actually lose the money, right? But if you focus on being good at your craft, then the money follows, right? So if you're a doctor, you focus on treating your patients, right? And the better you do that, the more those patients are willing to pay you, right? And same thing with like making a house, right? You focus on making good houses, and then based on that, people will pay you, the money will come. But if you're always looking to cut corners and to just kind of get your paycheck, then that craft will will kind of fall apart, right? So this is another thing akin to being a ruler, right? If a ruler is not good at ruling, not good at looking out for the interests of his or her subjects, um, then that person doesn't stay a ruler for very long, right? And then the final example here that Socrates focuses on here is what is kind of famously known as honor among thieves. Thrasymachus claims that every person is out to outdo one another, right? Everyone's looking to get over on another person, and basically no one can kind of be trusted. And Socrates makes this claim that really, even if you want to be a corrupt individual, even if you want to be something like a thief, or a criminal, you have to have a certain, and if you're going to do it in like a group, you have to have a certain amount of organization and trust in order to just be bad, right? So like even to pull off a heist, there has to be a certain amount of trust, a certain amount of honor, right? Respect for certain kind of rules and code in order for that those heists to take place, right? And also this can be translated to the individual, right? That a person who wants to be, say, a bank robber or something like that, they have to have a certain amount of discipline within themselves, right? And a certain understanding of kind of the norms and rules, and kind of appear as a good person to a certain extent in order to be bad, right? And so this is another sense in which, for Socrates, doing things good or right in the very traditional sense has to kind of conceptually precede um, doing them badly, right? So any instance in which you want to kind of lie to other people or get over on other people kind of has to only really works if you're, for the most part, doing things well, and you can be, for the most part, trusted and gain the trust of others, and all that kind of stuff. So the way I put this is that there's certain kind of logical priority of the good over the bad. This is a very deep philosophical point here that goes in lots of different directions in the history of philosophy, but the thing to kind of be aware of here is that Thrasymachus is really kind of giving the opposite end of the spectrum, where he really thinks there's no such thing as a universal sense of good at all, right? And Plato's really at the other end, where he thinks no, that there has to be a kind of universal sense of good, and these kind of reasons give some argumentation why. So, anyways, that's it for book one. See you later.